Bang! The courthouse doors slammed open. Handcuffs, chains. A man who looked like winter itself had chewed him up and spat him out onto the marble floor of justice. 71 years old. Robert Harrison. Combat boots held together with electrical tape, squeaking against polished stone with every shuffled step. Snow still melting off a coat that had seen too many storms. The bailiff didn't look up. The prosecutor barely glanced over. Another homeless case. Another problem to process and file away. But Judge Patricia Stevens saw something else. The way he held his shoulders, even broken, still straight. The way his eyes swept the room, not shame, but scanning, assessing, calculating exits like muscle memory carved in stone. Rocky Mountain Diner, criminal trespassing, 8 inches of snow. A man seeking shelter becomes a criminal. Nobody saw the scar on his neck. Nobody recognized the name Robert Harrison. Nobody knew this broken man had saved 7 lives in Fallujah. Nobody except the judge, who was about to change everything. Type honor. If you believe heroes deserve better, this Marine story will shock you. The bailiff's voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silence. Docket number 412, State of Colorado versus Robert Harrison. Trespassing, disturbing the peace. Judge Patricia Stevens felt something stir in her chest when she heard that name. Robert Harrison. Bobby Harrison. The name her son David had written about in email after email from Iraq, always with the same reverent soldier's reserve for legends. If it wasn't for Bobby Harrison, David had written from Fallujah in 2004, none of us would have made it home. The man's got nerves of steel and a heart bigger than Texas. She looked down at the defendant more carefully now. The man before her was a skeleton wrapped in rags, but there was something familiar about the way he carried himself. Even defeated, even broken by years on the streets, his posture held echoes of military bearing. Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres shuffled his papers with theatrical impatience. Young, ambitious, with perfectly pressed suits and a caseload that treated human beings like statistics. To him, this was just another vagrant disrupting the peace of paying customers. "Your Honor," Torres began with practiced dismissiveness, "we have a repeat offender here. Mr. Harrison has been cited multiple times for loitering, public intoxication, and now criminal trespassing. The owner of Rocky Mountain Diner called police because customers complained about a homeless man sleeping between the dumpsters." Patricia watched Bobby's reaction. Nothing. No anger, no protest, no defense. He sat like a man who had already accepted whatever judgment the world decided to impose on him. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, highlighting every line carved by hardship. But then she saw it. When Bobby shifted slightly in his chair, his collar moved just enough to reveal a jagged scar running along the left side of his neck. Not a clean surgical scar, but the kind of wound that comes from shrapnel or glass, hastily stitched in a field hospital. Patricia's breath caught. She remembered David's description. "Bobby's got this gnarly scar on his neck from when the house exploded. Says it doesn't hurt anymore, but I see him touch it when he thinks nobody's looking." The institutional coldness of the courtroom suddenly felt obscene. Here was a man who had written himself into her son's survival story, sitting in handcuffs for the crime of seeking shelter from a blizzard. Torres continued his prosecution with mechanical efficiency. The defendant was found at approximately 2:30 a.m., surrounded by shopping carts and refuse, disturbing customers trying to enjoy their late-night meals. This pattern of behavior creates a public health hazard and diminishes property values. The lies hung in the air like smoke. There had been no late-night customers during a blizzard, no refuse mentioned in the police report. But Bobby said nothing. He'd learned long ago that his word meant nothing against a badge and a pressed suit. Patricia's hand trembled as she reached for her phone under the bench. She typed quickly, "David Harrison, emergency legal representation needed. Courthouse, now." David Harrison wasn't related to the defendant, but he was the finest military attorney in Colorado and a man who understood the debt society owed its veterans. More importantly, he was someone who would listen when Patricia explained who was really sitting in that defendant's chair. The scar on Bobby's neck caught the light again as he shifted. Patricia closed her eyes and could almost hear her son's voice. Bobby Harrison saved 7 Marines that day, Mom. 7. Including me. He's the reason I got to come home and hug you again. When she opened her eyes, Bobby was looking directly at her. For just a moment, their gazes met. She wanted to say something, to reach across the void between bench and defendant's table, but protocol held her tongue. Not yet, but soon. The prosecution's case was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty. Torres painted Bobby as a chronic public nuisance, a man whose very existence was an affront to civilized society. Each word was carefully chosen to strip away humanity and replace it with legal terminology. Your Honor, this is Mr. Harrison's 4th citation in 6 months. Loitering at bus stops, sleeping in public parks, and now trespassing on private property. The business community has a right to operate without being subjected to vagrancy. Bobby flinched almost imperceptibly at the word vagrancy. His fingers moved unconsciously to his neck, tracing the scar through his torn collar. The gesture was so automatic, so deeply ingrained, that only Patricia noticed. The public defender finally arrived, Janet Walsh, 20 minutes late, her briefcase soaked from the snow and her attention already on the next case. She glanced at Bobby's file for maybe 30 seconds before standing. Your Honor, my client pleads no contest. We request time served and community service. No contest, not even a fight. Walsh didn't know she was throwing away the defense of a man who had once held off an entire insurgent cell to save 7 Marines. She saw only another homeless defendant to be processed through the system as quickly as possible. Patricia felt sick. The machine of justice was about to grind up a genuine hero, and nobody in the room except her knew it. Torres smiled, sensing easy victory. The state recommends 60 days county jail and a $1,500 fine, Your Honor. Mr. Harrison clearly hasn't learned from previous interventions. It's time to send a message that this community won't tolerate. The courtroom doors burst open with a bang that made everyone turn. Colonel David Harrison, retired Colorado Bar Association. I'm here to represent Mr. Robert Harrison. The man who strode into the courtroom carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that made people straighten their spines involuntarily. His suit was impeccable, his briefcase expensive leather, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man who had never lost a case that mattered. Torres barely concealed his sneer. Last-minute representation, Your Honor. Highly irregular. We were about to conclude. Accept the representation, Patricia said firmly. Proceed, Colonel Harrison. Bobby looked up in confusion. He'd never seen this lawyer before in his life, had no idea how he could afford such representation, and certainly hadn't called anyone. But Colonel Harrison moved with the efficiency of a man on a mission. Your Honor, I need 30 minutes to confer with my client and review the evidence. This case involves circumstances that haven't been properly represented. Torres protested. Your Honor, this is a simple trespassing case. The defendant was found sleeping on private property. What circumstances could possibly... Granted, Patricia interrupted. 30-minute recess. As the courtroom emptied, Colonel Harrison approached Bobby with the measured steps of a man carrying important knowledge. He pulled out a chair and sat down directly across from the defendant. Son, he said quietly, Judge Stevens thinks you might be someone special, someone her boy David served with in Fallujah. Is that true? Bobby's eyes widened. The name hit him like a physical blow. David Stevens. Lance Corporal David Stevens, 19 years old, from Denver, Colorado. The kid who'd written letters to his mom every single day until the IED took him in 2006. David, Bobby whispered, the first word he'd spoken since entering the courtroom. How do you know about David? Harrison leaned forward. Because his mother is sitting on that bench and she's been looking for you for 20 years. The words hung between them like a bridge across decades of pain. Bobby's hands began to shake. Not the tremor of age or cold, but the deep, bone-deep shaking of a man confronting ghosts he'd tried to bury. She knows who you are, Bobby. She knows what you did. And she's not going to let this kangaroo court railroad the man who saved her son's life. Bobby closed his eyes. When he opened them, Tears had carved clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks. For the first time in 20 years, Robert Bobby Harrison wasn't alone. The machine of justice was about to meet something it had never encountered before. A mother's love armed with legal authority and an absolute refusal to let heroes fall through the cracks. Torres had no idea what was coming for him. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted like weather before a storm. Colonel Harrison sat beside Bobby with the calm confidence of a man holding royal flush. Patricia took her seat with the bearing of a judge about to right a 20-year-old wrong. Only Torres remained oblivious to the fundamental change in the room's dynamic. "Your Honor," Torres began with renewed aggression, "regardless of new representation, the facts remain unchanged. Mr. Harrison was found trespassing on private property. The law is clear." "The law," Colonel Harrison interrupted, rising slowly, "is indeed clear, but the facts, Mr. Torres, are not what you think they are." Harrison moved to the evidence table with military precision. From his briefcase, he withdrew a thick manila folder stamped with Pentagon seals and classification markings that made the court clerk's eyes widen. "May I approach the bench, Your Honor?" Patricia nodded, though her heart was racing. She knew what was coming, but the formal revelation still felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Harrison placed the folder before her and spoke in a voice loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "Your Honor, I present evidence regarding the true identity and service record of the defendant, Gunnery Sergeant Robert James Harrison, United States Marine Corps, Force Reconnaissance." A ripple of confusion went through the gallery. Torres's confident expression began to crack around the edges. Bobby sat perfectly still, but his breathing had changed. The casual observers might have missed it, but Patricia saw the way his shoulders pulled back just slightly, the way his chin lifted an almost imperceptible degree. Muscle memory responding to his rank being spoken aloud for the first time in decades. "Gunnery Sergeant Harrison," Colonel Harrison continued, "didn't just serve his country in Operation Iraqi Freedom. On November 15, 2004, during house-to-house operations in Fallujah, he single-handedly prevented the deaths of 7 United States Marines. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear the ventilation system, the scratch of the court reporter's fingers, the distant sound of snow against windows. Harrison opened the folder and began to read from an official military report. Gunnery Sergeant Harrison remained in position under heavy enemy fire after ensuring the evacuation of wounded Marines. His voluntary decision to maintain overwatch provided crucial time for medical evacuation and prevented additional casualties. Torres stood up, confusion evident in his voice. "Your Honor, I don't understand the relevance." "Furthermore," Harrison continued without acknowledging the interruption, "Gunnery Sergeant Harrison was recommended for the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in combat. The recommendation was lost during a bureaucratic transfer following his medical discharge for traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder." Patricia's voice was steady, but her eyes held tears. "What we have before us isn't just a case, it's a portrait of systemic failure. A man who served with extraordinary courage, who was forgotten through administrative incompetence, and who now sits in a defendant's chair when he should be receiving the honors he earned." Bobby looked up at her then, really looked at her, and recognition dawned slowly across his weathered features. The resemblance was there in the eyes, in the set of the jaw. David had looked like his mother. "Ma'am," Bobby said quietly, his voice rough with disuse and emotion, "are you David's mom?" The question hit Patricia like a physical blow. 20 years of grief, 20 years of wondering about the man who had given her son extra time, 20 years of hoping to thank him properly. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I am." Bobby's composure finally cracked. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't save him longer. The IED, it was my fault. I should have—" "No." Patricia's voice cut through his anguish like a blade. "You gave him 2 extra years. 2 years to come home, to hug me, to write letters, to live. You gave me 2 more Christmas mornings with my son." The courtroom held its collective breath as judge and defendant looked at each other across the years of separation that had kept them apart. Torres sat down heavily, finally understanding that he was no longer prosecuting a vagrant. He was standing in the presence of a hero. What happened next wasn't supposed to happen in a routine trespassing case. Colonel Harrison approached the bench with documents that no one had expected to see in that courtroom. Pentagon letterhead, classified after-action reports, commendation records that had been buried in military bureaucracy for 2 decades. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to present the complete service record of Gunnery Sergeant Robert Harrison and the specific details of November 15, 2004. Torres rose weakly. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? Patricia's voice was steel wrapped in silk. Overruled. This court will hear the complete record. Harrison moved to the center of the courtroom, holding the after-action report like sacred text. On November 15, 2004, 2nd Squad, Bravo Company, was conducting clearing operations in the industrial district of Fallujah. At approximately 14:30 hours, the squad came under intense fire from a fortified position. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratch of pens as reporters frantically took notes. Lance Corporal David Stevens was the first to go down, caught in the initial burst of automatic weapons fire. Private First Class Martinez took shrapnel to the legs. Corporal Thompson was pinned behind a disabled vehicle with a sucking chest wound. Bobby's hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He was back there, hearing the crack of AK-47s, smelling cordite and blood, and the acrid smoke of burning buildings. The squad was trapped in a kill zone with no cover and no way out. Standard tactical doctrine called for immediate withdrawal to prevent additional casualties. Gunnery Sergeant Harrison had other ideas. Harrison's voice grew stronger as he read from the official report. Rather than order withdrawal, Gunnery Sergeant Harrison established a base of fire from an exposed position, drawing enemy attention while directing the evacuation of wounded Marines. When his M4 rifle jammed, he continued engagement with his sidearm. Patricia watched Bobby's face as the story unfolded. She could see him reliving every moment, every decision that had saved her son's life. The insurgent position was a reinforced house with multiple firing points. Gunnery Sergeant Harrison maintained his position for 17 minutes under continuous fire until close air support could neutralize the threat. In that 17 minutes, he enabled the medical evacuation of 3 critically wounded Marines and the tactical withdrawal of 4 others. The gallery leaned forward. This wasn't a legal proceeding anymore. It was a war story being told in a courtroom. The house exploded when an F-16 dropped a 500-pound bomb on the insurgent position. Gunnery Sergeant Harrison was thrown 15 feet by the blast. Shrapnel from the explosion caused severe lacerations to his neck and left shoulder. Bobby's hand moved unconsciously to his scar, the wound that had marked him for life, the visible reminder of the day he had chosen to stay behind. But here's what the official report doesn't capture, Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a more personal tone. Here's what Lance Corporal David Stevens wrote to his mother about that day. He pulled out a different set of papers, personal letters, written in a young Marine's careful handwriting. Mom, I need to tell you about Gunny Harrison. When everything went to hell today, he could have gotten us all out, could have followed doctrine and saved himself. Instead, he looked at us, kids, really, scared out of our minds, and he just said, "Not today. Today we all go home." Patricia's tears were falling freely now. These were her son's words, her son's voice echoing across 20 years. He stayed behind, Mom, stayed behind and drew their fire so we could get Martinez and Thompson out. They were shooting at him from 3 directions, and he just kept firing back, kept yelling at us to move, move, move. I looked back once and saw him standing in that street, and I knew I was looking at the bravest man I'd ever seen. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Torres had stopped taking notes. The court reporter was crying. Harrison continued reading. When the bomb hit, we thought he was dead. Found him buried under rubble with blood all over his neck, but he was still conscious. First thing he asked was whether we got everyone out. Not about his wounds, not about his pain. Just wanted to know if his Marines made it home. Bobby was crying now, silent tears that spoke of 20 years of survivors' guilt and unprocessed grief. The military recommended Gunnery Sergeant Harrison for the Navy Cross. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism in combat, personal risk above and beyond the call of duty, and direct action resulting in the preservation of American lives." The recommendation was filed on December 3, 2004. It was lost during a personnel transfer 3 days later. Harrison closed the folder and looked directly at Bobby. "7 Marines went home that day because of you, Gunny. 7 families got their sons back. David Stevens lived for 2 more years, got married, had a daughter he named Patricia after his mother. All because you decided that today was not the day any Marine gets left behind." The silence stretched until Patricia stood up from the bench, not as a judge, but as a mother. "All charges dismissed," she said quietly, with prejudice. But this was just the beginning. The dismissal of charges was only the first step in what would become a complete transformation of everything everyone thought they knew about justice, honor, and the debts we owe to those who serve. Colonel Harrison wasn't finished with his presentation. From his briefcase, he withdrew another folder, this one containing documents that made the Pentagon Papers look like a grocery list. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to present additional evidence regarding the broader context of Gunnery Sergeant Harrison's service and the systemic failures that led to his current circumstances." Patricia nodded, though she suspected she knew where this was heading. Gunnery Sergeant Harrison's service record shows 22 years of active duty, including 3 combat deployments. His medical discharge in 2005 came after diagnosis of severe PTSD and traumatic brain injury sustained during the Fallujah operation. He was entitled to full disability benefits, comprehensive medical care, and priority housing assistance. Torres, who had been silent since the first revelation, finally found his voice. "Your Honor, while we all respect Mr. Harrison's service, I'm not sure how this relates to the charges of—" "The charges are dismissed," Patricia reminded him firmly. "Continue, Colonel Harrison." "The problem, Your Honor, is that none of those benefits ever reached Sergeant Harrison. His discharge paperwork was incorrectly processed. His medical records were misfiled. His disability rating was never completed. For 20 years, the man who saved 7 lives has been invisible to the very system he served." Harrison approached Bobby's table and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Gunny, when's the last time you received any communication from the VA?" Bobby's voice was barely audible. "Never got nothing from nobody. Figured they forgot about me after I got out." "They didn't forget," Harrison said grimly. "They lost you. Your entire service record was misfiled under Robertson Herald due to a clerical error in 2005. Every benefit check, every medical appointment, every piece of correspondence has been going to a dead man for 20 years. The magnitude of the bureaucratic failure began to sink in around the courtroom. This wasn't just a case of a homeless veteran falling through cracks in the system. This was institutional negligence on a scale that bordered on criminal. Harrison continued his documentation. "I spent 3 hours this morning with VA officials. Gunnery Sergeant Harrison is owed $180,000 in back disability payments. He's entitled to full medical care for his service-connected injuries. He qualifies for priority housing assistance and vocational rehabilitation." Bobby stared at the lawyer like he was speaking a foreign language. After 20 years of being nobody, the idea that he was somebody, that he was owed something, was almost incomprehensible. "But that's not the most important part," Harrison said, turning to address the entire courtroom. "The most important part is that Lance Corporal David Stevens wasn't the only Marine whose life was saved that day." From his briefcase, Harrison produced a list of names. Private First Class Antonio Martinez, currently a detective with the Phoenix Police Department. Married, 3 children. Corporal Michael Thompson, Fire Chief in Tucson, Arizona. Married, 2 children. Staff Sergeant James Wilson. High school history teacher in Oklahoma City. Married, 4 children. He continued down the list, each name representing a life that had continued because Bobby Harrison had chosen to stay behind. 7 Marines came home that day. Those 7 Marines have built lives, raised families, served their communities. Between them, they have 19 children, 4 grandchildren. They've saved lives as police officers, firefighters, and teachers. The ripple effect of Gunnery Sergeant Harrison's heroism has touched hundreds of lives over the past 20 years. Patricia felt the weight of cosmic justice settling over the courtroom. This wasn't just about one homeless veteran. This was about the intersection of individual courage and collective responsibility. "I've contacted each of these Marines," Harrison continued. "They're flying to Denver tonight. They want to thank the man who gave them their lives back." Bobby looked up sharply. "They don't need to do that." "I was just doing my job." "No, Gunny," Harrison said gently. "You were doing something much more important than your job. You were deciding that every life under your protection mattered more than your own safety. That's not training. That's character." Outside the courthouse windows, the snow had stopped falling. Sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting long golden rays across the courtroom floor. Patricia made a decision that went against 20 years of judicial protocol. She stepped down from the bench and walked to Bobby's table. "Gunnery Sergeant Harrison," she said formally, "on behalf of the family of Lance Corporal David Stevens, and in recognition of your extraordinary service to our nation, this court extends its profound gratitude." She reached into her robe and withdrew something small, a medal that had been waiting 20 years to find its rightful owner. What followed wasn't just the resolution of a legal case. It was the restoration of a man's entire existence and the beginning of a transformation that would ripple through the Denver veteran community for years to come. The medal Patricia placed in Bobby's hands was David's posthumous Bronze Star, the decoration he'd received for his actions during a later operation in 2006. She'd carried it for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to honor her son's memory. "David would want you to have this," she said simply. "He wrote that you taught him what courage looked like." Bobby held the medal with trembling fingers, but his tears had stopped. For the first time in 20 years, his eyes held something other than defeat. The courtroom doors opened again, and this time it wasn't lawyers or bailiffs who entered. It was men in their 40s, some in suits, some in uniforms, all carrying themselves with the bearing of people who had served together in hell and survived. Antonio Martinez, the Phoenix detective, stepped forward first. The last time Bobby had seen him, he'd been 19 years old and bleeding out in an Iraqi street. "Gunny," Martinez said, his voice thick with emotion, "we've been looking for you." One by one they approached. Michael Thompson, the fire chief whose chest wound had healed into a scar he'd carried for 20 years. James Wilson, the teacher, whose students would never know that their history lessons came from a man who had lived through history. 4 others, each representing a life that had continued because of 17 minutes of extraordinary courage. Colonel Harrison stepped forward with one final document. "Gunnery Sergeant Harrison, by order of the Commandant of the Marine Corps and with the approval of the Secretary of Defense, you are hereby awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat operations." A Marine captain in dress blues stepped forward and pinned the Navy Cross to Bobby's torn coat. The contrast was stark. America's second highest decoration for valor attached to the rags of a forgotten man. But Bobby Harrison was no longer forgotten. The VA expedited his benefits. Housing advocates found him an apartment. The Denver Marine League established a support network. Most importantly, the 7 Marines he'd saved made sure he would never be alone again. 6 months later, Patricia would retire from the bench to establish the Bobby Harrison Foundation, dedicated to locating lost veterans and ensuring their service is never forgotten. The foundation would eventually help over 300 veterans navigate the bureaucratic maze that had swallowed Bobby for 2 decades. The courthouse case would become required reading at the VA Training Center. Bobby's story would be told in military leadership courses as an example of the Marine Corps motto, "Leave no one behind." And sometimes, late at night when the snow falls on Denver, Bobby Harrison sits in his warm apartment, wearing his Navy Cross, surrounded by pictures of the Marines he saved and letters from their families. He's no longer invisible. He's no longer forgotten. He's exactly what he always was, a Marine who decided that today was not the day anyone gets left behind. Some heroes wait 20 years for recognition. But heroes are worth the wait. Thank you for typing honor. These Marines deserve recognition. Subscribe for more stories of forgotten heroes. Support our mission. Buy me coffee link in pinned comment. Until next time, Semper Fi. Honor never fades.